Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We are in for a treat. Before we begin, I would like to direct your attention to the door to the right. If you need to leave early, please use the door. I'd also like to thank our speakers, sponsors, Peter Mueller, for your continual support and collaborations, our volunteers and audience members. None of this would be able to happen without your support. There will be a book signing after the lecture, so please stick around if you want to meet the lecturers. And if you're around on March 2nd, we are having Marlon Blackwell. Now, I would like to quickly introduce Space City and myself. I'm Kyle Kersey, Marketing Director of Space City and board member. Space City is a nonprofit organization that has, since 1997, continued to bring progressive and provocative speakers, architects, artists, designers, and thinkers to Seattle. Today, we are proud to present activists and architects Ersela Kripa and Steven Mueller, founders of Agency and Post, project of operative spatial technologies. They are the recipients of the Rome Prize, American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award, Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, and the New York Foundation of the Arts Fellowship, and many more. The duo is based out of El Paso, Texas, where Kripa is the director of Texas Tech University's College of Architecture, and where Mueller also teaches as associate professor and director of Post. Both Kripa and Mueller have spent a majority of their careers striving to make the global security complex more tangible. Their research has been slowly figuring the lens of the often obtuse and abstract and very real issues that are engendered by the security regimes that govern geographical borders and beyond. As an immigrant and refugee from the People's Republic of Albania, Kripa has experienced the military complex in some of its worst forms. The topics you will see today are certainly personal to both Ersela and Steven, and are ones that may stray from our typical scenographic fare, but they are no less important, and maybe more so. To quote Ersela, "The militarization of urban space impacts our daily lives through the use of design. That is everyone's business." We are thrilled to have you all. So I'll hand over the stage with no further ado, Ersela and Steven. Thank you.
Hi, so you probably read all of our well, I'll read what you just read. You saw our notes. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Space City. Peter, we had a really wonderful conversation about the book. So thank you. And thank you all for being here tonight. We are researchers and designers, as Kyle mentioned, and today we decided to break the lecture into two parts. We're going to talk a little bit about the book, and then we're also going to follow it with a few projects that are currently on the board and that are informed by the sort of similar thinking. And as researchers and designers, we embrace confrontational roles to create objects, forms, spaces, databases, and arguments that instrumentalize spatial justice. And we do this across various fronts and front lines, which are geographies and issues that transform our cities, our landscapes, and our discipline. The first fronts that we will visit are the ones we uncover in our book. They're secretive military training environments. And then we'll explore some related fronts in which military visioning and planning technologies, atmospheric sensing, environmental degradation, and extreme climate are weaponized, shaping new realms of light, air, and vision that we engage as designers. So the projects you'll see are kind of bracketed within light, air, and vision as milieus or as contexts. So a little bit about where we are from, which is also where Kyle's from. So we live and practice on the US-Mexico border, and we see this region not as defined by the border wall. We see it as a series of sheds and shared atmospheres, ecologies, and light and rights. So working in this protracted conflictual context, we work to shift the narrative, developing targeted methods to identify, appropriate, and subvert subperceptual urban and atmospheric events that violate human rights. This is the militarized landscape of the borderland, and it's really our office and our reason for being there. And we feel that we're there to enact alternatives to this kind of damaging and divisive use of infrastructure. This is our daily commute. It's our drive to school, driving along the international border fence. After the Secure Fence Act of 2006, 57 miles of border fence were completed here 2 years later, mostly along the channelized Rio Grande that you see here, which serves as the international boundary. You can see homes in Ciudad Juarez across the fence and across the riverbed. And so glimpses through this natural landscape, you can see sprinkled the security apparatus, you see the lights and the cameras, but also border agents that are entering and exit this no man's land. And a new highway that was just built that you see here straddles the border fence, with its structure actually at some point being completely south of the fence, but north of the political boundary. And so many people find themselves kind of crossing over the fence on their daily commute. It's common to see Border Patrol agents apprehending people in this area who make it past the fence, but then face this impassable infrastructural violent landscape. And here on the left, very quickly, you see where we are located in the Daniel Burnham train station, where our research happens. And so as a preamble to the work, shorter projects than the book have been our border dispatches for the Architect's newspaper, where we were tracking changes in the built environment on the US-Mexico border since the Trump presidential election. Through this work, we were documenting the legally questionable expansion of identification protocols that were beyond the limits of the ports of entry and into international territory in order to reduce asylum claims by Border Patrol. We were able to, we've been documenting the use of simulated border security infrastructures to train operatives in lethal force, as you see here on the bottom left. We've revealed the role of design and construction industries in managing migrant bodies and destroying the environment. And we've gained access to detention facilities to document their growing privatization and specialization. And you all, this is familiar to all of you, one of these investigative texts revealed the growing number of construction technology patents that were enabled as a result of these border wall prototypes. So while most of the conversation was about the physicality of the border wall, we were really interested in what the patents and the technology were that enabled these kinds of constructions. You may remember these companies in 2017 constructed these mock-ups to vie for the government contracts to install hundreds of miles of new border barriers. And so we did some digging and found that many of these companies involved in the mock-ups were applying for patents for the technology that they developed for the border wall, shown here. A patent of steel bollard fence design, specifically by Fisher Industries, which we uncovered and illustrated here, was piloted just outside of El Paso in the summer of 2019. And here it is, and on the right you see our digital model of it, just to understand it better. And this has since enabled rapid construction of miles of border wall through environmentally sensitive areas, indigenous land, and is contributing to an ongoing lethal humanitarian crisis at the border as migrants continue to seek alternative paths through the desert because the pathways now throughout the urban centers are closed from the border fence. This is the section of the border fence that Fisher Industries built with that patented technologies. It's under a mile long, and it was built within a few weeks without any kind of environmental impact studies. This is a really fragile ecosystem on the desert, and it's across from a former copper smelter, which means that all of this sand in the desert was highly polluted. And so scientists now are really concerned that metal pollution made it to the river, which is here in this image in the front. And this is a problem because people depend on the river for drinking water and for agricultural irrigation. And we've seen this technology continue to be deployed across the borderland with damaging effects on ecologies, landscapes, and human life. Our article, the point of the article really is to alert the architectural community to avoid this new building technique and not to be tempted by the faster, cheaper, better technology that was developed at such environmental and human costs. And so since then, somehow someone at Amnesty International was reading the Architect's newspaper and called us and said, "Who are you, and what is like? How are you finding this stuff out?" And so they called us, and in 2020 we worked with them to visualize the dangerous overcrowding and mismanagement of federal and private immigration detention facilities, which has contributed to disproportionate rates of COVID-19 infections in this vulnerable population. Using Amnesty's documents that they obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, we were able to geolocate and categorize 200 federally operated immigration detention facilities in the US. And the idea was to visualize their average detainee population and their capacity, so what they were designed for versus how many people they were housing, highlighting those that were dangerously overcrowded. And there's an interactive map online of these facilities that summarizes the findings in graphic overlays while providing searchable and zoomable facility-level data in support of the Amnesty report. In the online map, one can even zoom close enough and a layer of aerial images shows up to show the physical properties and the architecture of the buildings. The overcrowding was especially a problem in 2020 and 2021 in spreading COVID-19 infections in the already vulnerable immigrant detainee population. And so the report with our maps and original photographs that you see here advocated for the release of migrant detainees from detention while their paperwork was being processed. Stephen will talk about the book, but Peter Miller asked me to say that it has been it's a very long process. It took 6 years, very arduous, and it's really dense. But it was did I say that right? It's a very a long process.
We'll make it a bit shorter. We may talk about it for about 20 minutes, but the full book's over there if you're interested. So from these local and regional frontiers, where you see our interests are in sort of the conflation of the global security apparatus with local ecologies, human health and human bodies, we can zoom out to this kind of global front and investigate at a different scale in the book. So the book collects our original research, our writing, our mappings, and our speculative drawings that concern the many fronts that we see impacting global cities. The research in the book hopes to illuminate what we describe as the pervasive securocratic condition of the contemporary city, where the global security complex sort of shapes life in its own image, where life is simulated and governed by the spatial mechanisms and the byproducts of an expanding anti-urban global war. The US military, through its ubiquitous construction and reconstruction efforts around the globe, in military bases and other sites, has produced a vast geography of urban simulation that endeavors to shape both the reality of urban violence and a violent urban imaginary. And it targets the global city as ground zero for next generation warfare. So the book really concerns itself with these brick and mortar sites that the US military and other global militaries build in order to train their operatives for urban operations, basically to conduct urban warfare in global cities. A coordinated military training apparatus strategically deploys repeated types and tropes, particularly of the developing world and the developing world city, to prepare for the efficient delivery of lethal force in informal contexts, while simultaneously engaging in planning and nation-building efforts that seek to suppress their spread. So there is a design aspect to these environments as well. While conducting research for the book, we found and visited a number of these simulated cities that are used as urban warfare training sites, cataloging their forms and their materiality. The fronts, these sites we suggest in the book, are different kinds of global transnational space. New constellations of cities and urban patterns developed from the agonistic interchange of security and development pressures. Although its constituent parts may be geographically remote, the front is bound and shaped by a set of common characteristics, and it's a type of securocratic frontier. A front remaps territories, crosses borders, creates pockets of space beyond international law. The future of the front is of equal and immense interest to the military-industrial complex, the urbanizing poor, and the policymakers, the organizers, the planners, the designers, and the interventionists who find themselves increasingly called to the front in order to shape it. By identifying these sites, we hope to encourage multiple readings of these emerging urban forms and their logics. One logic is that the fronts are militaristic. The front represents sites of future struggles over the nature of informal city life. In this sense, the multiple geographies indexed by the book represent front lines, or vanguards, between the often opposing forces of security and development. They are epicenters in which the interests of the so-called developed and the developing worlds collide. Conceived as next-generation military battlegrounds, they are already the contemporary battlegrounds for social equity and spatial justice. Fronts are also disingenuous. So there's a multiple reading of the term front, as you can imagine. So fronts are disingenuous. The fronts are manifest both in real space and in the covert sites that simulate them. This is a kind of mirrored duality, where secrecy and subterfuge play important roles in both instances. So here the fronts uncover a duplicitous urban narrative populated by a series of cover stories, false flags, double agents, feints, and disguise. We also suggest that the fronts are meteorological, like a weather front. The military recast cities as a pointillistic assemblage of autonomous structures of governance, irrespective of the juridical and jurisdictional boundaries of the nation state. The constellations of city types that are presented in the maps and texts in the book suggest that urban identities are becoming fluid, presented as thickened zones of volatility and innovation destabilized amidst an ever-shifting backdrop of conflict, resource depletion, and migration. Military logisticians can confirm that cities now are operating as independent agents, independent from the nation states of which they're a part, free from the political structures and the sovereign governments whose borders would once have had them contained. To just dwell on this image a bit, this is an abandoned copper mining town in southwestern New Mexico, close to where we live, that has been repurposed as one of these simulated urban environments. And here you see the kind of suburban workers' housing in aerial view with the front and backyards. But in the lower part of the image, you can see some smaller buildings sort of arranged into an assemblage to begin to simulate what the operatives that run the site describe as a North African village. So for a major component of the book is what we call our simulated cities database. And for that simulated cities database, we uncovered over 500 of these sites. Building on what might be sort of available in maybe the popular press of the most popular, 10 or 12, we were able to locate 500. We used publicly available data, but data that was relatively inaccessible and kind of scattered or not consolidated and certainly not geolocated in order to uncover this hidden geography. So we looked at and we scraped government contracts, congressional hearings and appropriations, military construction documents and other journalistic sources, and then we ground truthed what we found through satellite imagery to locate each of these sites. This is the first public geolocated database of these secretive sites, and it shows the extent of its spread not only in the US, but throughout the world. The database can also demonstrate the diversity of the sites. So each of the urban simulations is increasingly specialized. And the sites are creating and emulating new and emerging types of urban forms. So here's a look at the spread just within the United States. You can see various types and clusters geographically distributed. Most military bases throughout the US anyway will have at least one site that simulates an urban environment, but many will have several. And some installations specialize in constructing and training in this type of environment, constructing multiple simulated cities, often with multiple simulated city types, and they run operations between them within the base boundaries. Moving up in scale, training operations also spread throughout the constellation of sites. So military training operations can sometimes move across multiple states, connecting with neighboring bases or contiguous airspace. The sites where the everyday and domestic environments of the city are duplicated help us to recognize how they're telegraphing the sites of future war. Violent conflict, the sites tell us, will increasingly be urban. It will enter the city and occupy our most private spaces. So we begin with an introductory chapter that details the emerging concepts of global insecurity, lays out this idea of the securocratic state and its sort of instantiations in urban and architectural space, emerging forms of urban life that these military environments are really indicating in a very advanced way, that all inform the investigation. Through the lens of urban simulation, we then explore shifting attitudes toward density and informality that are mapped onto a series of remote sites used for urban warfare simulation. The book also includes a detailed history of simulated urban environments. It's a long history. The book sort of specializes in advances over the last few decades. But this is a long legacy, and we unpack the many ways that military planning and military's involvement in the construction of architectural objects to simulate urban warfare has been integrated with and often informed architectural design and city design throughout the last century. So we include this detailed history of simulated urban environments that's used by the world's militaries and military academies and military planning academies. Importantly, we discuss one emerging type. It's kind of a mouthful. It's called the Combined Arms Collective Training Facility, but like everything in military parlance, it has a shorter acronym, the CACTF, which is really the new gold standard of simulated urbanism. For the US military in particular. The CACTF mandates the replication of a certain number and type of urban and architectural typologies to provide an authentically challenging training environment to prepare for counterinsurgency across various modes of the delivery of lethal force. Of this particular type, we've located over 30 of these facilities and can learn a lot about the military's posture towards urban environments from their analysis of their urban and architectural form.
And so the book is presented in 3 sections, and each details an emerging front, an urban geography in which the interests of informal development and global security collide to produce new urban forms. And here you see the proto-city, the logistic city, and the carceral city. The fronts are selected as parts of a continuum of urban developments from nascent securocratic constructions to revisionist interventions in more established cities. They range from the emerging proto-cities and city camps that punctuate the geographies of humanitarian government to existing cities infiltrated and transformed by the pressures of militarized planning and migrating populations, respectively. The fronts are presented as test cases in the book. They're dispatches from the frontier of international development, and they're sketches of an emerging world order. Each section then is divided into 2 chapters, with each chapter focusing on a spatial typology within the front, drawing from examples from emerging military training typologies related directly to the front and the effects of militarization on existing developing cities. We unpack the ways in which the front is spatially manifest, echoing doctrinal conceptions of space for military encounters. The chapters use case studies to outline the relationship between forces of global security and urban development and present alternative practices that work actively in the production of space in the securocratic frontier, exploiting the gaps within global security. The chapters together present 6 new spatial types that you see here, or rather existing spatial types that have been radically reimagined and reconstructed under the contemporary security apparatus: the camp, the zone, the dump, the graveyard, the squat, and the jail. Examples of subversive, in quotes, tactics act as counterpoints to the growing hegemony of these securocratic types and are presented at the end of each chapter. So here is one example, the zone. A fundamental and a recurring spatial problem for military action is the fortified occupation of land. On, quote, enemy land, bases and other defensive positions violently exclude externalities to enact a defensible, yet artificial interior for the occupying force. Establishing these islands of control within hostile territory mandates an articulation of a selectively permeable membrane, providing for the definition and preservation of boundaries to external threats, while allowing for that boundaries' occasional transgressions for the delivery of force. Thickened material and logistical boundaries inscribe zones of militarization and fluid sovereignty within conflict territories. Military training environments enact the zone mentality in 2 commonly constructed typologies. Is that a video? No. The forward operating base, commonly seen dotting the periphery of simulated urban cores, and the embassy, which often appears as the simulated city center. The forward operating base, or the FOB, occupies enemy space to provide a tenuous base for military operations, while the embassy carves out a fragile pocket of extra-jurisdictional sovereignty. In training, both types are often cast in defensive scenarios. From these examples, we can see that the zone, from a military perspective, is an unnatural spatial condition, a disruption to the equilibrium of its occupied host, an area of negative pressure or a high center of gravity for impending conflict. As such, the zone and its boundaries are in need of constant maintenance. The embassy as a training site commonly rehearses and in fact foreshadows real-world tensions arising from diplomatic presence abroad. Quantico has staged mock riots outside its mock embassy and annual training exercises since 1999, which appear to have set a model for similar training events through modern day. U.S. diplomatic security forces, after the attack on the U.S. embassy in Benghazi, if you remember that, were required to undergo intensive training in undisclosed embassy simulation sites. The simulated embassy recursively iterates the zone logic, projected as nested islands of sovereignty and security within a city enmeshed in conflict. Most confirmed types are located firmly in the center of the simulated city, yet surrounded by expansive grounds and ringed with high walls. These barriers in training scenarios often denote a thin, contested line between allies and protesters or potential combatants. The interior of the type similarly sequesters secure from insecure space. A private facility in Memphis, operated by Tier 1 Group, advertises a mock embassy available for force-on-force training, citing the unpredictable layout, all unique stairwells, hidden rooms as desirable design features that make the type adequately, in quotes, hellish for training operatives to conduct clearing exercises. It is as if the architecture of diplomacy is cast as suspect, the work of an unhinged architect, with nonsensical embellishments presumed to be an impediment to urban operations. So here are some images zooming into what these fronts are and these simulated urban environments are. And in excerpted urbanisms and secretive sites like this, the CACTF that Stephen mentioned, this is the CACTF at Camp Grayling in Michigan. And by locating and categorizing all of these sites, our simulated cities database, through that we can see that while each site at a glance might appear unique, common forms and structures populate them all, which is what we're interested in typologically as architects. Assembling the catalog of CACTFs, for instance, and identifying familiar forms amongst the urban clusters, we can start to see familiar footprints, repeating architectural plans and assemblages copied throughout the sites, as well as outliers, individual modifications specific to the training needs of a particular site or branch of service. We were able to identify repeating typologies and in many cases identical replicas. The CACTF requires over 30 buildings of various types and excerpts of different forms of urbanism and urban occupation. It requires an embassy, a jail, a city hall, a police station, tunnels, and other types of infrastructures. The types deployed at these CACTFs typically include also, in quotes, a shanty town, effectively criminalizing self-built environments and casting them as inherently suspect. The book considers military planning as an alternate architectural and urban history. Planners study typical construction patterns like curtain walls and box wall construction that you see here in these drawings to discern if and how a building might best be used or weaponized. The book details the military's aversion to what they call false fronts, the disjunction between a building's facade and its true structure or materiality that was common in postmodernism. Disingenuous facades might obscure the inner structure or the material honesty, problematizing the military's ability to use buildings as cover or concealment or an embattlement for certain types of weapons. Military planners profess, and this is a quote, the true character of the building can be seen always from the rear. City combat training sites are becoming more and more urban in character, achieving a density and variety of buildings and infrastructures that steadily approach the diversity and intensity of real-world cities. While the opposite is also true, that cities are becoming a training site, as you see here on the right, abandoned cities. The geography of urban simulation now oscillates between two ideological poles. On the one hand are the attempts to encapsulate in high fidelity the physical realities of the city, faithfully replicating specificities of type, material, place, and event. On the other hand are the efforts to relentlessly generalize, approximate, and reduce urban and societal forms, endlessly proliferating the lowest common denominators of unidentified, unnamed future threats. At the National Guard Training Center in Camp Gruber that you see here in this photo, these two poles collapse in an actual physical model. A tabletop model contains scaled replicas of two recently constructed simulated urban environments on base. On one side, there's a replica of a European-style village fielding familiar building types common across decades of the urban training geography. On the other side is an exact duplicate of an Afghan village, signaling a targeted, geolocated reality. As training demands change, the table flips, revealing the forecasted operations for that day. And so we were recently invited by Cynthia Davidson at LOG to be part of this exhibition called Model Behavior at Cooper Union this past fall. And so this was an exciting moment for us to actually build our own model of these false fronts. So here you see the logic on the left, and then the constructed model of a flattened cubical globe that captures the embassy being built at different stages. And so I'll end the book with this slide. As we've seen, a large number of secretive urban simulation sites have propagated and evolved over the last several decades. All signs suggest this shadow urbanism will only continue to spread. These sites are more than just a collection of urban simulacra. They are spatial mechanisms for exerting state power. From this position, on the simulated sites, a militaristic viewpoint of our collective urban futures is continuously absorbed, rehearsed, and ingrained, threatening to project back into the world and shape the cities in its image. However, we hope that another city is possible.
So we'll start entering some other fronts here. As we mentioned, we'll cover how our interest in global security and its manifestations are also shaping other types of territories beyond these physical simulated sites. The next few projects will involve the kind of domain or the front of light. Starting with a focused research project that we call an ultra-violent border. We're currently working on merging investigative territorial research with design research, partially in our practice agency and also partially developed in the Research Center post at Texas Tech University, which focus in both cases on issues of urbanization and desertification at the US-Mexico border. Shifting patterns of ultraviolet exposure in North America map very closely to the international border with high intensities even in winter months, intensifying at the southern boundary. So the UV map maps to the border. The 30th parallel, which crosses the borderland very close to where we live in El Paso, at more or less at its center, is a charged exposure boundary. With the effects of climate change, populations below this boundary will see increased risk of sunburn and other negative health effects related to UV exposure. This is also one of the major issues that's driving sort of climate migration across the border. The lack of shade in the borderland landscape and the amount of atmospheric scattering from airborne dust increases the health risk to individuals in this particular territory. At the same time, the national security apparatus has become expert at deploying tactical infrastructures that mitigate the impact of ultraviolet radiation on its own agents in order to inspect and manage other bodies in this landscape more efficiently. Building on these tactical interventions, the federal border security apparatus has developed an increasing appetite for shade and has continued to invest in more permanent and purpose-built structures to extend their cover and strengthen their position in the landscape, resulting in an extensive inventory of shade structures that serve the security state primarily. At a port of entry, for instance, shade becomes a national security concern. When screening technologies like license plate readers and radiation monitors are not protected in shade, they can overheat and fail to operate, drawing concern and additional government oversight and funding for these structures. The highly securitized El Paso Ciudad Juarez metroplex is one of the largest binational urban environments in the Western Hemisphere, where the physiological effects of solar radiation are relentlessly rendered on vulnerable populations. The metroplex is host to some of the most traveled international pedestrian bridges between the US and Mexico, connecting the adjacent downtown areas, and as you know, is also a hotspot for sort of human migration. Within the increasingly austere and securitized public spaces of the border zone, pedestrians are subjected to high levels of solar radiation on daily cross-border commutes. In a desert city subject to unparalleled geopolitical and environmental stresses, access to shade is what Sam Bloch has described as an index of inequality. So migrants, asylum seekers, and detainees have been kept under makeshift shade structures beneath bridges for days at a time and exposed to UV damage while waiting to cross the border, or they're given just not nearly enough shade for long days waiting to be processed. This was the condition a few years ago during one of the peaks in Central American migration, just minutes actually from where we have our center. So here we'll show the efforts in the research center, which is called, again, this is the Post Research Center, Project for Operative Spatial Technologies, and a project that we call Irradiated Shade. So here we've been developing what we call shade surplus, shade deficit, and irradiated shade maps of public space. We're using remote sensing and computational analysis to identify sites at particular risk to UV exposure, and we're developing our own computational workflows and representational strategies to address shade designs from a so-called scatter perspective. So to just kind of unpack what we mean by irradiated shade, one of the conditions that we find most alarming is that even within conditions like ours in the desert, when you're in a shaded condition and you think that you might be protected from ultraviolet exposure because there is so much airborne particulate and pollution in the air, UVB rays, which are actually the most damaging, can actually scatter and infiltrate shaded conditions. And so that's what we mean by irradiated shade, is this sort of hidden threat within conditions that otherwise would seem to be protected, where people are subject to the damaging effects of UVB, which include skin damage, eye damage, and all sorts of other harmful health effects. So to unpack this, we start with a focus on the area near the international boundary where there's a high degree of pedestrian activity of travelers entering and leaving the US through pedestrian bridges. So just some orientation to our context here. You can see the channelized Rio Grande, Rio Bravo which serves as the international boundary here, with the mid-rise and high-rise urban core of downtown El Paso at the top of the image, with lower-rise neighborhoods moving south into Ciudad Juarez. So working with tools of architects and planners, working in GIS for this, using some built-in tools, and also developing our own processing workflows to extend what is known invisible. So here we're using, for instance, Landsat satellite data to calculate land surface temperature in midsummer, which begins to describe the character of this space, where you can see some increased heat island effects. In all of these images, basically red is intense heat or intense UV exposure, and yellow is less intense. So it begins to describe the character with the heat island effects throughout the approach to the border, and particular hotspots near the pedestrian bridges and the transit connections near the port of entry. You can see the two bridges, hopefully, at the lower left of the image. If we map diffuse solar radiation, so the condition that actually irradiates shade, we can see a clearly unequal and asymmetrical distribution of UV protection. Relatively low amounts of diffuse radiation are shown here in the yellow, and these are mostly in the urban core and areas with high slope and vegetation away from the border and communities with higher income. As you approach the border in the international bridges, though, exposure increases. So there are broad swaths of high exposure to diffuse radiation that cover some of the lowest income zip codes in the city, and in fact in all of the US, signaling access to urban UV protection as an under-considered condition of environmental inequity. Running some graphic and numeric overlays of various base layers, we can begin to see some compound effects. Introducing sort of human inhabitation of this landscape, we can combine land surface temperature and distance to transit to understand how long people might be exposed within these conditions, and we can calculate areas that are generally hotter in which pedestrians would have longer commutes. With other overlays of direct and diffuse radiation, we can begin to understand the need to design for changing concerns throughout a single urban corridor. Using 3D information, we can begin to kind of increase the resolution and understand the impact on the people in this environment, but it's still at a relatively low level. For instance, using LiDAR point cloud data here to reveal diffuse radiation in the urban core as compared to the pedestrian bridges, you can see a high degree of overexposure for the pedestrian environments here. So to make this even higher resolution and to try to understand more about the spatial conditions that create this inequity, we're actually borrowing some of the hidden logics that are baked into some of this GIS software, and we're daylighting it by developing our own tools in order to visualize and assess the condition in 3D space. And move it into a more immediate design and drawing environment. To better understand the impact of building geometry on UV exposure in urban space, we developed this spherical projection algorithm using Rhino and Grasshopper. Basically, the condition I described of irradiated shade, the thing you have to know here is that the amount of radiation that enters into shade actually correlates to the degree of open sky that's visible from within a shaded condition. So if we can model and map and understand the orientation of the sky exposure from any location in a 3D environment, we can drill down with greater precision in terms of who might be more vulnerably exposed. So each intersection in the borderland yields a different and highly articulated sky exposure map, which we can use as a computable surface. Raw data from even the surface area, for instance, allows us to make quick assessments about the extent to which different intersections are exposed, and the particular geometry can actually help us understand in which orientations and what times of day and what times of year they are most exposed. To communicate this to a broader public too, we also unroll the spherical projection into a kind of panorama style drawing of the skyline as it is seen from any point within the city, to allow designers and the public to see the particular geometry of their sky exposure and to see the impact of any interventions with that sky exposure through a design. From these assessments, we can see at a much higher resolution than we could with available tools and available data, using GIS, for instance. We can see the differences in exposure now along the pedestrian corridors that approach the bridge, and we can locate the areas most in need of additional protection. We've sampled every major pedestrian intersection in our borderland to compile what we call our sky exposure catalog. We call these the eggshell drawings, but we've color-coded each of them by their exposure areas to graphically identify areas at the highest risk of exposure to diffuse radiation.
And so what does this all mean, and how does this leave our academic context? All of our research projects, we strive with all of them to kind of exit that the academic context and to understand design as a tool in response to our research. And so that research translated into a project in collaboration with a nonprofit organization locally, Insights El Paso. They are the stewards of the dinosaur tracks site in El Paso, which is an archaeological site, and it contains the sort of the highest number of the best preserved dinosaur footprints in the northern American continent. And this is where scientists come to study dinosaur family behavior. And so this nonprofit offers science education for kids outside of school, which for us that means in the summer. And in the summer, you cannot be outside unless it's before sunrise or after sunset. It's incredibly hot for the kids, and so the sites are completely unprotected and they look like this. So they came to us and said, we heard you're doing research on UV protection, can we partner and can you design and help us build a protected classroom? And so like any good architectural classroom project, the idea was to cover the longest span with freest free span, essentially structure with maximum coverage and minimal materials, and so avoiding columns. And so our answer was to go way back to understand the reciprocal frame and how a reciprocal frame here might help us through building with small members to create a dome that would be a free span. But because we're in the desert and the charge was to protect against UV exposure, we took the structural members and kind of stretched them out and turned them into surfaces that would be CNC milled and scored and bent, so that while they still, the structural members behave as such, the flaps, the extension, could actually nest together and create a shade structure. Also, because budgets are constrained, we're looking at various ways to cut and to assemble the units that maximize the use of material while minimize costs. And the results of the nesting produce a surface like this that is that produces a kind of a continuous shade protection, but while allowing porosity, because we also have really, really high speed, strong winds in the spring, and the idea was to be able to mitigate uplift, and so it's porous in the sectional direction, and it's kind of continuous in planimetric direction. And then each member gets rotated, and so that allows us to gain curvature without having to design unique members. Through variations, through that kind of workflow that Stephen just described, from GIS to Rhino through Grasshopper, we were able to optimize the kind of shade thickness that makes the most sense given the context and what we're interested in providing in terms of protection. Wow, this is washed out. Oh no. So imagine where the EDCBA letters are. Imagine those are so. Oh no, this is the best drawing. So the dome here is placed back into a digital model of the context, and we're looking at the topography and the directionality of sunlight, and how perhaps being protected, using the topography as protection in relationship to the dome, we actually are able to kind of predict the most protected areas through from UVB. And Okay, you kind of see this. All right. It was this, that drawing was like this, but more layered. And so we're also using, when the project will be constructed, we're going to use this as a prototype, but also as a didactic tool, as a feedback loop that allows us to understand optimizing conditions where protected, where you have this kind of moving gradient. You see the letters here through A, B, C, D, different locations where there are layerings of being in complete shade and not seeing any sky exposure versus being in shade and seeing sky exposure, and kind of measuring and understanding the sort of the best strategy moving forward if this were to be replicated. So we landed on something like this. That's a minimally disturbed ground. The ground is only disturbed to make it accessible so that every seat in this kind of low slope amphitheater is accessible by any differently abled child. And then it very lightly touches the ground through these very thin 4 columns that connect the dome to themselves through this ring beam. And also because we also, with a nonprofit, we're acting as kind of just helping them to fundraise as a way to kind of talk to the community. We separated the project into essentially the material disciplines. And so people who might be working on the ground versus the concrete company that might donate the concrete versus the steel, where the structural engineer is donating his services. And so to be able to kind of separate a project in a relationship to a kind of a community effort project has been incredibly challenging, but also rewarding. So the project, we finally have a contractor who's willing to take this on, because when people see those pieces, it's kind of nerve-wracking, but we broke ground and we start construction soon, and we're kind of really excited about measuring it and as it comes together.
The next kind of main topic is the idea of the realm of air and binational airsheds. Starting with the research in a project that we describe as atmospheric jurisdiction, our work really seeks to forge identities and promote dialogue across real and imagined boundaries. And the vector in this work that we're considering that is the conception of these transboundary atmospheres. There are a number of dynamic and often highly polluted airsheds that span the US-Mexico border that co-produce complex environmental effects with transboundary populations and binational urban centers. Our context, which you see here, is defined and controlled by layered jurisdictional borders where mineralized infrastructures delineate local and regional areas, while the atmosphere transgresses them. The dusty season let's turn that down. The dusty season in the region pushes particulate matter across these boundaries and problematizes environmental monitoring and therefore environmental regulations, right? Endangering public health. Despite our shared air basin and the shared problems that we face with our neighbors, the jurisdictional fragmentation obscures the common issues that we have in the valley. Looking here into Ciudad Juarez, you can see our shared valley, where atmospheric inversions together with the colors of the high desert sunsets can begin to make visible the ecological distress that the region is suffering, sometimes creating conditions like these that can last for days in the spring. Atmospheric jurisdictions, like their terrestrial counterparts, are often defined by borders. While some atmospheric administrative borderlines are drawn to coincide with and therefore reinforce existing geopolitical constructs like national borders, others intentionally remap the territories below. Our critical cartography, which you can't see here, of aerial territories reveals competing attitudes of contemporary airsheds to the jurisdictions that they help to forge or subvert. So as part of this, we uncover an air monitoring regime that reinforces the national border. The travel of airborne particulate into and within the US has long been considered an existential threat to national security. And just in one example, since 2003, a program called BioWatch, a national biosurveillance program, has employed federal authorities and enlisted air monitor stations in secretive locations around all of our land and water borders. Every day, a large team of public health officials tests samples of inbound air, scanning for microscopic airborne threats to national airspace. At a slightly different scale from the national, we look at the borders between cities and how airsheds span between them, the multiple multi-jurisdictional atmospheric administrative constructs within national airspace that assemble otherwise disjointed state and county authorities in the service of a shared environmental action. As aerial territories consolidate and compound, they form entirely new geographies beyond the traditionally conceived urban extents. So similar to how we see cities developing into city regions, we can see airsheds developing into airshed megaregions. We've seen two fundamentally different geographies of atmospheric assessment now, a subdivision of national airspace in order to reinforce a sovereign boundary, and an aggregation of urbanized environments that meets the border as an artificial limit. In our region, the Paso del Norte, on the US-Mexico border, these two constructs actually exist simultaneously, and they produce a hyperbolically atomized transnational air basin amidst significant environmental, urban, and demographic transformations. Our airshed spans and subverts the boundaries of multiple national, state, and binational jurisdictions in what can only be described as a complex patchwork. We contend with 2 countries, for instance, 3 states, and 2 cities. Asymmetries between all of these jurisdictions in the frequency that they report, the standards that they use, the protocols, the systems of measurement, all conspire to divide, disjoin, and make discontinuous the data sets that would otherwise reveal conditions of environmental injustice or in need of action. By extrapolating the range of environmental sensors in a map like this, where we're mapping blind spots in the environmental regulatory system, we can assess a density of monitoring and a scale of resolution, and we find significant disparities in the investment and the resolution throughout the urbanized borderland.
And so what do we do with this information? We realize that the sort of the national monitoring of air quality is so averaged at the scale of the region that the kind of the quality of air in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez sort of metroplex, it really comes out as if it's good air quality, but in fact we know that it isn't. And so in our practice, we design these interventions and representations in order to address these kinds of environmental justice issues in our own region. We have developed an extensive collection of Arduino-based sensors, which, if you know, they're inexpensive and very easy to work with. And we've been installing them on both sides of the border in order to build our own hyper-localized data set of air quality. And this is the project called Nephelometry that was sponsored by a local arts collective. And here, this idea of our kind of artificial transboundary jurisdictional fragmentation of sheds, we are mapping the border region as a collection of binational ecoregions, and one of them being the Chihuahua Desert, which crosses the border right where we are in New Mexico and Texas, West Texas. So in red there is where El Paso and Ciudad Juarez are. And so the Chihuahuan Desert is kind of a continuous ecoregion that ignores the political boundary. And 45 minutes south of us, a drive are the Samalayuca sand dunes, which are made of 100% pure silica. And if you know anything about dust or sand, that means it's incredibly airborne, really light, and it has a very easy time making it into our respiratory system. And to give you a sense of the scale and the size of our dust, springtime dusty season and dust events, this is one that is kind of recorded at the scale of satellite imagery. And then here you see, if you can see, yes, in blue, the sort of the jurisdictional fragmentation that is completely ignored by the kind of the continuous dust cloud in the spring season. And so that's an issue. How do you measure, right? Who gets to measure and who gets to know? And in this context where most of the communities in Ciudad Juarez are self-settled without much infrastructure, the kind of the compound effect of environmental neglect and infrastructural investment neglect really produce this kind of volatile environment in terms of airborne particulate matter. And these are, this is an example of atmospheric inversions. You see it at the foothills of the mountain, this kind of gray haze. That just means that polluted air never makes it out into the atmosphere through the night, and so it continuously swirls around the valley. And so our kind of self-proposed task was to develop these dust sensors, just Arduino DIY dust sensors that were housed in either camera housing or electrical junction boxes. And these are both artifacts that are ubiquitous around our region, and so no one even looks twice. And so part of the design challenge that we get excited about was designing these kind of flexible 3D printed kind of little sort of packaging forms that allowed for different compartments of sensors, but also created an ergonomic area where dust can enter and measure. So this is a sample of the homes in Juarez that volunteer to host these sensors, and then they would share the data with us daily. And some of the studies for how the different parts of the sensors might be able to perform within a kind of a hollowed out shell of a camera. But all of that was to produce this kind of imagery that renders really kind of visible the specific issue. So by locating in a digital model of the region, the kind of the locations of the dust sensors in relationship to wind patterns hourly, in relationship to kind of their layering over time, we start to understand that the origin sites are not unique, and that where they land are not unique to one nation or one jurisdiction, that the entire valley shares this thickened air. There's funny stories where people in Juarez say, it's El Paso's fault that it's so dusty today, and people in El Paso say it's Juarez's fault because they don't pave the roads. And so this was a way to kind of spark that conversation and to talk about that the origin of the dust and the landing might not matter, but what matters are the sort of the hourly changes in the air that continue to swirl this mass around. So this was a drawing that was made for a drawing codes exhibition that Adam Marcus with Michael Kubo are putting together as part of their book. But the idea is to find ways to draw these invisible kinds of agents outside of the kind of the jurisdictional monitoring system that Stephen showed. And then we'll end on this last project.
So the last topic really focuses on how military visioning technologies have historically impacted the design and regulation of urban environments and populations. The project is called Spectral. We were actually invited as part of Exhibit Columbus, by Exhibit Columbus, to design and fabricate a kind of, let's say, a prototype that engages part of our sort of design research. And so for this project, we were looking at recent advances in multispectral imaging technologies from satellites that are able to collect infrared, ultraviolet spectrum information beyond the visible spectrum. So recent advances that have been developed through military and security research have led to a widespread increase in the popular availability and use of affordable sensors, cameras, and handheld devices that are now capable of detecting previously unseen or invisible conditions beyond the visible spectrum within urban environments. Spectral, the installation, is a custom fabricated design that deploys a matrix of infrared reflective material to shield a public space and its users from multispectral sensing by distorting and camouflaging the image capture and image recognition capacity of aerial thermal imaging technologies. The installation is built with aluminum composite material, probably familiar to you all, ACM. Thermal heat signatures are undetectable in infrared photography when passing behind the material, and it provides a kind of affordable, lightweight, easily accessible material to deploy in a public space. Just as designers of the built environment have developed expertise in designing for the optical qualities of light and shadow historically, we argue we must now broaden our domain to include the provision of what we're calling multispectral shadow. The installation is designed as a series of distorted reticular frames. Reticles, like crosshairs you see here, are horizontal and vertical registration marks that are used for optical targeting and georeferencing by a number of optical devices, including for aerial surveys that use photogrammetry, for instance. For the installation to complicate and confuse this machine vision, the expected two-dimensional cruciform shape of the reticle is extruded into a three-dimensional form. And the repeated appearance of similar reticular forms at multiple depths problematizes the dimensional registration of the object. The forms are each built from 2 central panels. Can we see drawings? Yes, great. 2 central panels of CNC routed ACM that are slotted together and bolted into 4 side panels. The parts, with an eye towards economy, are designed to nest tightly on standard 4x8 sheets, maximizing the protective volume while minimizing the material waste. We use, as in a lot of our projects, we use a kind of rapidly deployable technique of flat packing, so the parts can easily stack in a minimal volume for the ease of shipping before and after installation to provide a kind of ready camouflage for a public event in a public space.
So you see here, so the flat packing means that then we have to find ways to bend and fold everything on site. And for most of the installation, it's just me and Steven, so we made this kind of medieval-looking jig on the left that you see that it helped us to kind of speed up the folding process. The assumption is always that either us or people who are not necessarily in the construction industry can build our projects. So the pre-cut holes that you see here in the anchors help to make the assembly foolproof. The folded nesting base detail speeds up the assembly time as parts just kind of easily slip and lock into place. We had a really small team that helped us install this, and so we installed it just in a few days. Generally, we like to design these kind of small, really quick, low-budget installations because they help us think through ideas of deployable and kind of rapidly erected assemblies that are built by teams that are on the ground. To achieve maximum effect, the repetitive array kind of tries to achieve a high degree of optical variety within the economy of the discrete parts. The project is constructed as 6 bundles in this urban alley, and the urban alley is used as a pedestrian passageway and a site for public events. From the street, the bundles appear as a continuous wall. They shield pedestrians from street view while also providing a visual backdrop for events. And the target-like forms are designed to simultaneously address and manipulate several different vantage points from which aerial optical technologies typically capture images of urban form. From the overhead, the plan view here, typical of satellite photography, the forms appear as a grid of targets. But from the oblique isometric view, typical of aerial drone photography, the broad sides of the form start to block vision and create multispectral shadow. From the ground level, the forms reveal a layered inner and outer construction with varying optical and thermal characteristics. And for the night installation, we installed an LED array of lights, and these kinds of tall shadows expand the reach of the project and kind of create a much larger backdrop. And so we were testing this that summer, the impacts beyond the visible spectrum as well. And so we were inviting people to have these kinds of parties where there's thermal activity happening so that we could measure it. So using some of the same ubiquitous handheld thermal imaging technologies that we're concerned with, we're able to see how the piece impacts the multispectral city, creating a safe space for individual and collective signatures beyond the detection of multispectral surveillance. We continue to explore this and test this impact through different imaging devices. This part of the research has also turned into a much larger kind of research thinking and writing about what this means at the city level, as a multispectral city. And we imagine this deployed for protests or other kinds of events in urban environments. So thank you.